He laughed. That was the first thing that struck me. The laugh wasn't nervous or grateful or even embarrassed. It was bold, sharp, and mean. A young man's laugh at an old man's expense. My nephew, standing in the doorway of my study clutching the signed slip that proved I had just paid off the last of his gambling debts, leaned back and laughed like he had won. I remember the way the sound bounced against the bookshelves. I had chosen each book there myself over the course of my life. Thick ledgers, case studies, financial records, memoirs of men who built fortunes out of dust and silence. The books absorbed his laughter like witnesses too polite to interrupt. I did not interrupt either. I simply leaned back in my chair, folded my hands, and let him enjoy himself. "You're too soft, Uncle," he said, finally stuffing the slip into his jacket pocket as though it were a victory medal. "Always have been. That's why everyone knows they can lean on you. You'll pay their way, cover their mess, and smile while doing it. You can't say no." I said nothing. Silence is not weakness, though he thought it was. Silence is a place where thoughts sharpen. He had no idea what I had bought that day. He believed it was his freedom. What I purchased was something else entirely, his future. The study smelled faintly of leather and dust, and the late afternoon light filtered through the blinds in thin stripes catching the silver of my beard. He stood in that same light, careless, thinking himself untouchable. His shoes were polished, but not by his own hand. His tie was loose, his smile crooked. A young man who had never truly faced consequence. I remembered his father, my brother. A man who worked hard, who bent his back to build a roof for his family. A man who used to say Edward debts are chains. Never wear them unless you plan to break them with your own hands. His son had taken that lesson and spat on it. Chains were nothing to him because he believed there was always an uncle, always me, who would step forward with the bolt cutters. He didn't notice me studying him. The way his hands trembled slightly as he tucked away the paper. He was not as confident as he wished me to believe. That laughter was a shield brittle as glass. "Don't worry, Uncle," he said already, turning to leave. "One day I'll return the favor. Maybe." Another laugh. Another careless wave of the hand. The door clicked shut. Silence filled the study once again, but this time it was heavy, pulsing with something far older than anger. You see, I do not believe in shouting. I do not believe in raised fists or in broken furniture or in threats yelled across a room. Those are the tools of men who cannot wait, men who cannot think. My tools are paper, patience, and memory. And I remember everything. When he was small, I carried him on my shoulders at the county fair. When his father passed, I held his mother's hand in the church pew, promising I would help. When he was too young to manage his inheritance, I guided it, shielded it, even grew it. He never knew how close he had come to ruin even then. I had saved him more than once quietly without asking for thanks, but gratitude is a currency some men never trade in. So I let him laugh. I let him believe. And as he laughed, I thought of the papers waiting in the top drawer of my desk, the liens, the contracts, the quiet signatures. I had learned long ago that the true price of debt is not in the paying, but in the holding. What he didn't know was that by paying, I had acquired his silence, and soon his land. The study grew dim as the sun sank and the shadows stretched across the floor. I sat alone listening to the faint hum of the city beyond the windows, and I smiled, because he thought he had taken something from me. But in truth, I had already begun taking everything from him. The night after his laughter lingered longer than it should have. I sat by the window of my home, the curtains half drawn, and let the city hum lull me into thought. The street below flickered with yellow lamps, the occasional figure moving briskly, collars turned against the evening wind. My house stood apart, an older building, solid brick, weathered but dependable, much like me. On the small oak table beside my chair lay a cup of tea growing colder as time passed. I hadn't touched it in an hour. The steam had faded, leaving only a faint ring of moisture on the porcelain rim. But I held the cup anyway, warm in my hand, reminding myself that patience had always been my strength. Patience and record keeping. In the drawer of that same table were files, neatly bound promissory notes, receipts, signed assurances from men who once smirked like my nephew and now lowered their gaze when they crossed paths with me. They were not enemies. They were simply careless men who believed kindness had no memory. I kept those records not for revenge but for readiness. Life has a way of rewarding those who prepare. My nephew, however, was different. He was not careless by accident. He was careless by choice. He believed the world would bend for him because it always had. That belief had become his armor. And as I listened to the city's faint whistle outside, I realized I had spent years polishing that armor for him, keeping it from rusting, protecting him from the rain. I had been his shield, his quiet rescuer, and now he mocked me for it. I thought of my brother again. I could see his hands roughened by labor, stained from ink and soil alike. A man who balanced ledgers at night and hammered nails by day. He had raised his son to expect honesty, but not hardship. Then, fate in its mercilessness took him too soon. I had stepped in believing I was honoring blood. Perhaps I was only feeding arrogance. The papers from the bank lay still in my study where he had left them. His debt was no longer his, it was mine. That he thought made me weak, but I have lived long enough to know that when a debt is in my hands, it becomes a chain I hold, and I decide how tightly it pulls. I rose from the chair and crossed the room slowly. The carpet was soft beneath my steps, but worn in places where I paced most often. I stopped before the cabinet opened the bottom drawer and withdrew a folder marked only with his initials. Inside was a record stretching years back. Small loans, repaid late investments, squandered little signs of arrogance that I had smoothed over. I had documented everything, not because I sought to use it, but because I had always been a man who needed order. Order keeps the world from slipping into chaos. Order makes even betrayal manageable. I placed the folder on the table, sat back down, and stared at it. His life reduced to paper and ink. He would never understand the weight of it. He had never kept an account, never balanced anything more complicated than a dice cup. But I understood, and that meant I already had him. The sound of rain began to tap against the glass. Gentle, rhythmic, almost like fingers drumming in thought. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the rhythm steady me. Rain on glass, debt on paper, both inevitable, both cleansing in their own way. I remembered the moment earlier that day when he had laughed. I had noticed the twitch in his jaw, the faint shadow under his eyes, the mark of a man already drowning but pretending to swim. That laugh had not been victory. It had been fear dressed in arrogance. He knew, even if he refused to admit it, that a man like me does not pay debts for free. Tomorrow I would visit the bank again. Not to pay anything further, no, that part was done, but to speak quietly with the manager. I had known him for years, watched his children grow, advised him once when the bank itself faced a lean season. He trusted me, respected me. Men like him understand the value of a quiet signature more than a loud promise. I imagined the conversation already. The faint clearing of his throat, the lowering of his voice as he explained what I already knew, that by paying my nephew's debts, I had assumed the rights of the creditors. That his deed, his precious property, was no longer his alone. It was tethered, held, waiting in the silent hands of paper and ink. I smiled into the dark. People believe revenge is a fire. They think it roars, consumes, leaves nothing but ashes. But revenge, true revenge, is colder. It is a quiet frost that settles slowly, creeping inch by inch until one morning the betrayer wakes to find his world frozen beneath it. I finished the cold tea in a single swallow, bitter but grounding. Then I closed the folder, slid it back into its drawer, and rose to prepare for bed. My body moved slower these days, joints stiff from years of long hours at desks and late nights of work. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Age, if it robs the body, repays the debt with clarity. As I turned off the lamp, the room fell into shadow. My reflection in the window lingered for a moment, white hair, steady eyes, the faintest trace of a smile. He thought he had laughed at me, but one day he would understand. Not with shouts, not with blows, not even with an argument. He would understand when a letter arrived official and heavy bearing my name where his once was. That night, I slept more soundly than I had in months. Because, for the first time, I was not just rescuing him, I was reclaiming myself. There is a strange thing about memory. It sharpens not in the triumphs, but in the sacrifices. Victories blur over time, but the nights you gave something up, those stay etched like carvings in stone. I remember the first night I paid a debt for family. It was not my nephew's debt then. He was still a boy, too young to gamble, too young even to understand the smell of stale whiskey in a tavern. It was his father, my brother Merrick. Merrick had borrowed more than he could manage during a bad harvest. The fields had flooded, the livestock sickened, and the creditors circled like crows. He was proud, stubborn, unwilling to admit defeat. But I saw the numbers the way I always did. Numbers do not lie. They told me he would lose the farm, and with it, everything our father had broken his back to leave us. So I took my savings, all of it, and paid the men at the tavern table. They sneered at first, thinking me another fool to bleed. But when I spread the papers across the oak and made them sign their names in ink, the sneers turned to shrugs. The debt was gone, transferred, placed neatly in my hand. Marek never asked how. He hugged me, clapped my back, said he owed me one. And for a time, that was enough. Years passed, and I repeated the ritual more times than I care to count. A roof repaired here, a doctor paid there, a note settled before the sheriff's men could call. Quiet payments, quiet sacrifices. I told myself I was preserving family, protecting the name our father had given us, but in truth, I think I was building a habit. Some men drink when they are weary. I paid debts. It gave me the illusion of control of keeping chaos at bay. When Merrick died far too young, his boy was barely grown. I remember the funeral, the black coats, the bowed heads, the hollow sound of earth striking wood. My nephew clung to his mother's sleeve, his face pale but dry. He did not cry. Not then. Some part of me pitied him, some part admired his composure. I promised my brother silently as we lowered him down that I would look after the boy. Promises are dangerous things. At first I did well by him. I guided his education, kept him in school when others would have pulled him to work. I gave him allowance, modest but steady. I showed him ledgers, tried to teach him how numbers could reveal truths hidden from the eye. He nodded, pretended to listen, but I could see his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the games and friends waiting outside. I told myself he was young, that patience would bear fruit, but patience is only a virtue when it meets respect. In his eyes, my patience became indulgence. He mistook my silence for softness. By the time he turned 20, he had tasted credit. The world of easy promises pulled him in cards, dice, fast horses. He liked the thrill, the rush of risk, and when risk soured, he knew where to turn. To me, the first time he came, his voice was hesitant. His hands trembled slightly as he explained. He had borrowed for something foolish, lost more than he could repay. His eyes darted like a trapped animal's. I sighed, nodded, and settled the account. He swore it would never happen again. It did. The second time he was bolder. The third he came smiling, as though it were a small joke between us. By the fifth, he no longer pretended remorse. He would sit across from me, legs crossed, and state the figure plainly as if he were reading a grocery list. And I fooled that I was paid. Always with conditions, always with warnings, but warnings without teeth are just whispers in the wind. Why did I continue? That question haunted me. Perhaps it was blood, the stubborn loyalty of family. Perhaps it was guilt for surviving while my brother did not. Perhaps it was pride, the need to prove I could manage what Merrick could not. Most likely, it was all three braided into a rope I could not untangle. I worked long hours to maintain it. My banking career had given me skills, but also enemies. Colleagues whispered that I was too rigid, too old-fashioned, too unwilling to play the new games of speculation. Yet those same men came to me when they needed quiet calculations, discreet advice. I built wealth not with gambles, but with patience, bonds, land, modest businesses. Nothing flashy, nothing loud, but strong. And much of it I poured into my family, into my nephew. He grew fat on that quiet sacrifice. Not in body, but in spirit. Arrogant, untouchable. He learned that debts were not chains, but ladders. Ladders he could climb while I held steady at the bottom. I recall one afternoon, perhaps 10 years ago. We sat in a cafe's sunlight spilling through lace curtains, the air thick with the smell of roasted beans. He leaned back in his chair, laughing with friends, retelling the story of how the old man had once again come to his rescue. His friends laughed too, not unkindly, but in that way youth laugh at someone they do not fear. I sat in the corner, unseen, my newspaper a shield. He never noticed me, never considered that I might hear. That was the first time I felt the sting. Not of money lost, but of respect squandered. Still, I did nothing. I told myself it was the price of blood. That one day he would see. That one day he would understand the weight I carried for him. But he never did. Instead, the debts grew larger. The laughter grew sharper. And the silence I once believed was strength began to feel like a noose. The night he stood in my study and laughed outright, not in a cafe, not behind my back, but in my face, that was the moment the rope snapped. Not because of the money, not even because of the words, but because I saw in his eyes no trace of gratitude, no flicker of recognition of what had been given, only contempt. And contempt once born can never be undone. I see that now looking back. All those sacrifices, all those nights spent poring over ledgers, working late covering for him, were not wasted. They were the foundation of something else. A structure I had been building without realizing it. Because every debt I paid was not erased. It was recorded. Every chain he cast aside I picked up. And now those chains were all linked, knotted, drawn together into a net I already held in my hands. He thought I had freed him. In truth, I had bound him tighter than he could imagine. The older I get, the more I realize that betrayal is rarely sudden. It is a slow erosion. A wall does not collapse because of one storm. It crumbles because water has been seeping into its cracks for years. My nephew's laugh that day in my study was only the collapse. The weakening had begun long before. I remember one evening when he was still a boy, no older than 16. He came to me with a request. He wanted a watch. Not a simple one, not the kind a working man wears to keep the hours of labor, but a gold timepiece from a shop in the city. Everyone has one, he said, though I knew that wasn't true. Everyone in his circle, perhaps the sons of men who spent freely. Not everyone. I told him no, not harshly, but firmly. I explained the value of restraint, of saving, of learning to live within one's means. His eyes darkened. It was the first time he looked at me not with affection, but with resentment. The next week, the watch appeared on his wrist anyway. He had borrowed for it. And when the lender came knocking, it was my door they knocked on. That was the first crack. Small but deep. Years later, when he was in his 20s, he asked me to co-sign for a business venture. A tavern, he said, with friends who were sure bets. I declined. He pouted, argued, told me I was old-fashioned, afraid of risk. The tavern failed within a year. The friends vanished. The creditors, of course, did not. And once again, it was my signature that settled the balance. I began to notice a pattern. Each failure was not a lesson for him, but for me. Each debt was not a burden for him, but for me. He floated through the years on the certainty that someone, his uncle, the fool, would catch him. And I did. Always. Until I began to realize that I was not catching him. I was carrying him. But carrying another man's weight only makes him weaker. There was a night, I recall it, with a clarity that chills me still. A winter night, the wind sharp against the windows, the fire crackling low in the grate. He had come again hat in hand, though the gesture was more performance than plea. He leaned against my mantle, telling me of another investment gone wrong. His words were smooth, rehearsed, almost like lines in a play he had performed many times before. I asked him quietly, "Do you ever wonder why I always say yes?" He laughed, not the cruel laugh of later years, but a lighter one, careless. "Because you can't help yourself, uncle. You need to be needed." That sentence cut deeper than he knew, because there was truth in it. I let him believe it was the whole truth. In reality, every yes was a stone in a foundation, every payment a brick. I was building something. At the time, I didn't know it consciously, but somewhere deep inside, I must have understood, because I kept every paper, I filed every receipt, I documented every foolishness. I remember laying them out once late at night after he had gone. Page upon page, signature upon signature. The evidence of a life lived on borrowed coin. My study table looked less like a desk and more like a courtroom exhibit. I stared at the papers and something shifted inside me. I realized then that I had not been a fool. I had been patient. Patient beyond reason perhaps, but patient all the same. Each act of sacrifice had doubled as an act of preparation. I had been tightening the knots of a net one thread at a time. He had thought he was free, but freedom without responsibility is only another form of bondage. The truth was, I no longer wanted thanks. I no longer expected it. Gratitude once denied loses its sweetness. What I wanted was recognition, not from him, but from the world. Recognition that silence is not weakness, that patience is not folly, that kindness when ignored can turn into power. The day he laughed in my study, it all became clear. His debts were not shackles on me. They were shackles I held in my hand, and I had been too blind to notice the keys jingling in my pocket. I remember sitting in that room after he left, the light fading, my hand resting on the folder with his initials. My mind replayed his laugh, his words, "You can't say no." But he was wrong. I could say no. I had said yes only because it suited me, because each yes was a tightening of the rope, and soon, very soon, I would give my final answer. When I closed my eyes that night, I saw my father's face, stern, lined weary from labor. I heard his voice again, "Debts are chains." And for the first time, I did not see myself as the one wearing them. I saw myself as the one holding them. There is power in that shift. Power so quiet, so profound, it changes the way you breathe. The next morning, I rose with new clarity. My movements felt lighter, my steps steadier. I brewed coffee, its rich aroma filling the kitchen, and opened the window to let in the cool air. Outside, the city moved in its usual rhythm. Merchants, sweeping stoops, carts rattling down, cobbled streets, children darting between doorways. Life continued as it always did. But within me, something had ended and something else had begun. I was done carrying him. From that day, every action was deliberate. Every errand, every visit to the bank, every handshake with a lawyer, all of it was part of a quiet orchestration. I no longer thought of myself as his protector. I thought of myself as his creditor. And creditors, unlike family, are patient, but not forgiving. The irony still amuses me. He believed he was mocking my weakness, but in that laughter he revealed his blindness. He never noticed the quiet accumulation of paper, the weight of signatures, the trail of ink that led not away from him but toward me. And so I smiled, not at him but at the inevitability of it all. Because one day soon a deed would change hands, and when it did, he would learn the difference between charity and leverage. Betrayal is not always a dagger in the back. Sometimes it is a smile too wide, a laugh too loud, a careless word spoken where silence would have been kinder. My nephew's betrayal was not in any single act of theft or violence, it was in the way he made a spectacle of me. I remember one evening a dinner gathering at his friend's estate. The kind of house where chandeliers dripped crystal and wine flowed too freely, where men with more credit than coin boasted of their ventures. He had invited me, though not out of respect. No, he wanted me there as a prop. "Gentlemen," he said, clinking his glass, drawing all eyes to him, "let me introduce you to the man who has kept me afloat all these years." His smile was broad, his tone laced with mockery. "My Uncle Edward, the softest touch this side of the river. If you ever find yourself in debt, just pray for an uncle like mine." The table erupted with laughter. I sat there, my fork poised above the plate, the aroma of roasted duck rising in a wave that suddenly seemed suffocating. Their laughter was not cruel, not malicious, just careless, the way men laugh at a fool in a story. But I was no story. I was flesh, blood, patience, and quiet steel. I said nothing. I smiled, faintly nodded once, as though the remark had slid off me like water from stone. Inside, however, the words etched themselves deep. That was the night I stopped thinking of him as family. Later, as the evening dwindled and the candles burned low, he pulled me aside, still grinning, his breath tinged with wine. "You don't mind, do you, Uncle?" he asked. "It's just a bit of fun. Everyone knows you'll always be there for me." I studied him in that moment. His eyes were bloodshot, but behind the haze there was something sharp, something deliberate. It was not merely drunkenness that had loosed his tongue, it was contempt, a belief that my patience made me lesser. I went home that night with the laughter still echoing in my ears. The streets were slick with rain lamps casting shimmering halos on the cobblestones. My carriage wheels hissed against the wet ground, and I sat inside staring at my gloved hands, remembering my father's voice again. Debts are chains, yes. And my nephew was chaining himself with every jest, every glass of wine poured at my expense. But unlike him, I was not laughing. The next day I walked through the market as I often did, my cane tapping against the stones, the scent of bread and fish mingling in the air. People nodded, some tipped their hats. Respect, not loud, not ostentatious, but steady. It struck me then how little he understood of true power. Power was not in mockery. Power was in silence that others recognized, even feared a little. I passed the tailor, the banker, the bookseller. Each greeted me with a small word, a gesture of deference. They knew me. They remembered. My nephew had none of that. He had only noise, and noise fades. Another memory presses against me sharper still. A family gathering small and unremarkable. We sat around a long table, cousins and aunts, the air heavy with stew and bread. My nephew, bold as ever, told a story of how I had once settled a particularly large debt for him. He mimicked my voice, exaggerated my gestures, drew laughter from the younger ones. Even his mother chuckled weakly, though I saw shame flicker in her eyes. "Uncle can't resist a good sob story," he concluded, raising his cup. "He's our family's patron saint of fools." This time, the laughter cut. Not because of what he said, but because of the way the others didn't stop it. They laughed too. They allowed the insult to take root. I smiled again, said nothing, but inside, something coiled tight. When the evening ended, I kissed my sister-in-law's hand, nodded to the cousins, and stepped into the cold night. My nephew's voice carried faintly after me, still retelling his story, still laughing. It was then I knew I had given him too much, more than money. I had given him the belief that he was untouchable, and belief, when left unchecked, becomes arrogance. Arrogance, however, is brittle. All it takes is the right pressure, at the right point, and it shatters. I carried that thought with me in the weeks that followed. Each time he appeared at my door with another tale, another request, I listened. I nodded. Sometimes I even agreed, but I agreed slowly with measured words. He never noticed the change. He never noticed that I was no longer indulging him, I was measuring him, weighing him like a merchant weighs coin testing for the counterfeit. He spoke too freely now, too loudly. He had begun to boast not only in private circles, but in public ones. He told acquaintances at the tavern that I would always pay, that I was too proud to let the family name be shamed. He called me the old ledger, a nickname passed around like a joke as though I were nothing more than a book to be balanced. What he did not understand was that ledgers do balance. Always. I began to notice others watching me with curiosity. Men who whispered in corners, who asked discreetly if it was true. Did I really pay all his debts? Did I really shoulder his burdens without protest? Their eyes flickered with amusement, but also with calculation. They smelled opportunity. I let them believe it, because the more they believed, the deeper they let him borrow. And the deeper he borrowed, the closer he came to me. You see, betrayal is not just an act against a man. It is also a revelation of who that man truly is. My nephew had revealed himself. Not as a victim of youth, not as a boy in need of guidance, but as a man who thought mockery was a crown. And crowns can be taken. I remember the last time he laughed in my presence before everything began to turn. He had come into my study bold as ever, tossing a paper onto my desk, a deed, this time for property he had mortgaged. "Don't worry, uncle," he said, leaning against the bookshelf, smugness dripping from every word. "It's just another bit of land. If it goes, it goes. You'll pay it, and we'll all be square." I studied the paper, the ink still fresh, the signature slightly smudged from his haste. I could smell the faint trace of tobacco on it, the mark of the tavern where the deal had been struck, and I smiled. Not for him, for myself. Because that paper was not a burden, it was a gift. The beginning of the end. It is strange how betrayal does not wound you in the moment alone. The moment passes, the laugh fades, the insult drifts away, but it lingers afterwards, settling into the bones like a chill you cannot shake. That night, after my nephew had tossed the deed onto my desk and dismissed it as though it were a playing card, I sat long after he left. The room was still the lamplight casting thin shadows across the shelves. The smell of tobacco from his coat lingered in the air. I stared at the deed, the ink glistening faintly in the glow, and felt a heaviness spread in my chest. It was not anger. Anger burns fast and loud. This was quieter. A kind of exhaustion, the weight of years pressing down. I thought of my brother again, of his hands rough with calluses, of his voice urging honesty, of the sweat he had poured into building something worth leaving behind. Would he have laughed too, had he lived to see his son like this? Would he have defended him? Or would he too have seen the rot beneath the smile? The question twisted in me, but there was no answer. The dead do not speak, and the living rarely listen. I rose and crossed to the window, pulling back the curtain. Outside the night stretched wide the city, a quilt of lamps and shadows. I pressed a hand to the cool glass and let the silence steady me. My reflection looked back, white hair-lined face, eyes that had seen too much. A man some mistook for weary. A man my nephew mistook for soft. But weariness and softness are not the same. I remembered every time he had mocked me, every careless story he had told at my expense. Each one returned to me, now sharper in memory than it had been in the moment. The cafe where he imitated my voice, turning me into a caricature. The family table where he christened me patron saint of fools. The estate dinner where he paraded me before his friends like a purse with legs. Each moment struck like a hammer, not breaking me but forging me. Because here is the truth I had always known: paper endures. Laughter fades, but ink does not. And I had ink. I sat again at my desk, drew the folder of his debts before me, and spread the papers across the surface. They covered the wood like fallen leaves, each one a memory, a scar, a thread, and a net. Promissory notes, liens, contracts his life written in careless signatures. I traced a finger across one of them, remembering the day I signed it on his behalf. He had been younger, then still able to summon shame when he came to me. His hands had shaken. He had promised reform. I had believed him, or at least wanted to. Now, years later, that paper was not a record of my kindness. It was a weapon. I felt something shift inside me as I looked at those documents. For years, I had thought of them as burdens, weights I carried to keep him afloat. That night, I realized they were not burdens at all. They were leverage. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and breathed deeply. The scent of old paper and ink filled my lungs, grounding me. And in that silence, I made my decision. I would no longer be the shield he mocked. I would become the chain he never saw tightening. The days that followed were curiously calm. I moved through them as if through water, each motion deliberate, unhurried. I visited the market, the tailor, the bank. I greeted acquaintances, shared polite words, smiled faintly when addressed. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. I no longer carried his debts. I held them. The distinction may seem small, but it is everything. To carry a debt is to suffer under it. To hold it is to wield it. And wield it I would. I recall one afternoon in particular. I sat in the banker's office, the air smelling faintly of polished wood and ink. He leaned across the desk, lowering his voice as though the walls themselves might overhear. "You know, Edward," he said, "by settling these accounts, you are now the creditor of record. Technically, his obligations are to you." I smiled faintly, folded my hands, and replied, "Yes, I know." The banker blinked, surprised, perhaps, by my calm, but I had known it long before he said it. I had known it the moment I picked up the first receipt, the first note. What he offered me was not news. It was confirmation. When I left the office, the street outside seemed brighter, the air crisper. The world had not changed, but my place in it had. I was no longer a man mocked for kindness. I was a man holding the quiet strings of another's life. My nephew still laughed, of course. He boasted, drank, played, all while assuming I trailed behind him with open purse. He never noticed the way my eyes lingered on him now, not with pity, but with calculation. He never noticed the way my silences had deepened, not of weariness, but of intent. He thought I was still the fool. But the fool was gone. One evening, I returned home to find him waiting on my porch, leaning against the rail as though he owned the place. He grinned when he saw me, that same careless grin, and said, "Uncle, I need you again. Just a little more. You know you can't say no." I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and left him standing there a moment before I answered. "We'll see," I said quietly. It was a small thing, but I saw the flicker in his eyes. A pause, a hesitation. He laughed it off, of course, but I had seen it. The first crack in his certainty. That was enough. Because cracks, once they appear, only grow. That night, as I extinguished the lamp and lay in bed, I stared into the dark and felt no bitterness, no regret, only resolve. The years of sacrifice, the sting of betrayal, the laughter, the mockery, all of it had been leading here. I would not raise my voice, I would not lift my hand, I would not even confront him. I would simply wait for the day the papers bore fruit. And when that day came, I would smile. When you decide to act, the world rarely notices. There are no trumpets, no announcements, no sudden shifts in the wind. The world continues as it always does, people rushing to their trades carts rattling down the streets, merchants shouting prices. And yet beneath the surface, something subtle begins to change. For me, it began with a walk to the bank. The morning was brisk, the air clean after a night of rain. My cane tapped rhythmically against the cobblestones, a steady beat that matched the pace of my thoughts. Men nodded as I passed, women offered faint smiles, children darted between legs without a care. To them, I was the same old Edward, the quiet man who always carried himself with patience. They could not see that patience was no longer a burden. It was a blade I had sharpened to its edge. The bank manager greeted me warmly. We had known each other for years. I had once advised him through a season when the institution wavered on collapse. He still remembered. Respect lingers in men like him. He ushered me into his office, closed the door, and offered me tea. I declined. I wanted clarity, not comfort. We spoke at length but softly. The papers were already there, contracts, transfers, documents with neat lettering, and lines waiting for signatures. Each one was small, unremarkable to the eye. Yet each was a thread in the net I had woven across decades. With every pen stroke, I drew the knots tighter. One note consolidated here. A lien formally acknowledged there. Quiet legal adjustments, all perfectly proper, all perfectly binding. I did not need deception. The truth itself was weapon enough. When I rose from the banker's desk, my name was heavier than before. Not in shame, but in weight. My nephew's obligations, once scattered, now converged. They pointed not outward to taverns or creditors, but inward to me. I stepped outside into the light of noon and paused. The city bustled around me, but I stood still, letting the sun strike my face. In that moment, I felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who has finally shifted from defense to offense. Not with rage, not with haste, with certainty. That evening, my nephew arrived unannounced. He pushed through my door without knocking, as he often did, his coat smelling of smoke and liquor. His grin was wide, his confidence unchecked. "Uncle," he said, clapping me on the shoulder, "you're going to love this one. I've struck a deal, bold, daring, but I just need a little more backing from you. You'll see it'll pay tenfold." I looked at him carefully, then at the papers he spread before me. They were sloppy, ink-smudged, terms vague. He had not read them fully. I could tell by the way he brushed past details, focusing only on the promise of gain. I let him speak. I let him boast. And then when he finished, I said, "Only leave them here. I'll look them over." He smirked, mistaking my calm for submission. "I knew you'd come through, Uncle. You always do." When he left, I gathered the papers into a neat pile, tied them with twine, and placed them in the drawer alongside the others. Another thread, another knot. What he never realized was that each time he asked, he gave me more than I gave him. He gave me proof, evidence, authority. Each request was another rope he handed me willingly, never noticing the tightening around his own wrist. In the days that followed, I began visiting lawyers. Not the flashy kind with loud voices and sharp suits, but the quiet ones. The men who worked in dim offices, lined with dusty books, who knew the law like a priest, no scripture. We spoke in hushed tones, heads bent together over documents. They asked no questions beyond what was necessary. They understood discretion. Every paper signed, every agreement notarized was another step. I never hurried. I never pushed. The beauty of paper is that it moves at its own pace, slow and steady. But once signed, once sealed, it is immovable. One lawyer, an old colleague of mine, leaned back in his chair after drafting a particularly critical transfer. He studied me for a moment, then said, "Edward, you've waited a long time for this, haven't you?" I met his gaze evenly. "Patience is only waiting if you are idle." I have never been idle. He smiled faintly, dipped his pen, and signed. At night, I returned home to my study. The house was quiet, the clock ticking steadily on the mantel, the smell of old wood settling into the walls. I would sit at my desk, lay out the growing stack of documents, and read them slowly, savoring each line. To another man, they might look dull ink seals, signatures. To me, they were the architecture of justice. My nephew continued as he always had, laughing, drinking, boasting. He visited me less often now, perhaps believing I had grown weary of his demands, perhaps thinking me too old to be of further use. But in truth, he had already given me everything I needed. One evening, I saw him across the street outside a tavern. He was laughing loudly, a crowd around him, his arms spread wide as he told some tale. I could not hear the words, but I could guess. Likely another story of how the old man, the fool, had once again carried him. I did not feel anger. I felt a kind of solemn pity, because while he laughed, I knew that the laughter was hollow. Beneath it, the walls of his world were already shifting, already crumbling, though he had not yet felt the tremor. I turned away and walked home, the sound of his laughter fading behind me. In my study, I lit a single lamp, sat before the papers, and let the silence settle. The silence was no longer heavy. It was purposeful, because I knew what he did, not the deed he mocked, the property he dismissed, so carelessly was already slipping from his grasp, and when the time came, it would land not in the hands of strangers, but in mine. That night, as I extinguished the lamp and prepared for sleep, I whispered to the dark, not as a prayer, but as a certainty. It has begun. There comes a moment in every long game when silence turns into motion. The pieces that once sat idle on the board begin to slide, not with noise or drama, but with the quiet inevitability of gravity pulling a stone downhill. For me, that moment arrived in the form of a letter. It was a simple envelope, unremarkable in appearance, delivered with the rest of the day's post. Inside was a notice from a creditor, not to my nephew, but to me. A confirmation that the outstanding note, long since paid by my hand, was officially assigned to my name. I held it between my fingers, felt the grain of the paper, the raised edge of the seal. To another man, it was bureaucracy. To me, it was power. That evening, I placed the letter atop the growing pile in my study. I sat back, folded my hands, and let my eyes wander over the documents spread before me. One by one, the fragments of his recklessness had gathered under my roof. They no longer lived in the smoky corners of taverns or in the hands of impatient creditors. They were mine. Each signature, each seal, each record was a thread, and together they formed a rope. My nephew had given me that rope willingly, year after year, never realizing he was tightening it around himself. In the days that followed, I visited my lawyers more frequently. Their offices smelled of old leather and ink, the walls lined with books whose spines bore the weight of centuries of law. We spoke in low voices, heads bent close while pens scratched steadily across parchment. Each session ended the same, a new document signed, a new seal pressed, another quiet piece of his future redirected into my hands. One lawyer, a cautious man with a habit of polishing his spectacles when nervous, asked me, "Do you wish to notify him of these proceedings, Edward?" I shook my head slowly. Number. Let him laugh while he still can. The lawyer hesitated, then nodded. He understood. Men who deal in paper know the satisfaction of silence. Meanwhile, my nephew continued in his ways. I saw him one afternoon across the market square, surrounded by friends gesturing wildly as he spun another story. His coat was fine, his boots polished, his voice loud enough to carry. He looked every inch the man in command of his life. But I knew better. I watched from a distance as he tossed coins to a vendor careless, as though money were endless. The vendor smiled, but I saw the faint flicker in his eyes, a question of doubt. Even the merchants were beginning to sense it. A man cannot outrun his debts forever, especially when those debts no longer sleep in strangers' ledgers but in mine. I turned away before he saw me. I did not need his acknowledgement. What I held in my study was acknowledgement enough. At night, I would sit with the documents laid out like a map. I traced the lines, the seals, the dates, seeing not chaos but structure. Each debt was a beam. Each leaned a wall. Together they formed the architecture of his downfall and the foundation of my justice. The first true shift came when one of his creditors, a shrewd man who had once tried to bleed him dry, visited me instead. He removed his hat, sat stiffly in my study, and said, "Edward, it seems the young man's obligations are no longer mine to chase. They are yours. I trust you will see them settled properly." I offered him tea, which he declined. I simply nodded, replying, "They are already settled." And that was the end of it. A man who once hounded my nephew now deferred to me. The power of paper is that absolute. Word spread, though, never loudly. Whispers only, murmurs in corners, nods exchanged when I passed. The shift had begun. My nephew did not see it. He was too busy laughing, too busy believing the world still bent to him. One evening, he came again to my house swaggering as always. He dropped into a chair without invitation, poured himself a glass of brandy from my cabinet, and said, "Uncle, I've done it again. A deal too good to resist. But I need you to cover a small detail until it pays out." I studied him as he drank the amber liquid catching the lamplight. His confidence was unshaken. He truly believed I would never refuse. I answered only, "Leave me the papers." He smirked, slid them across the desk, and leaned back as though he had won once more. He never noticed the difference in my eyes, the calculation behind my silence. When he left, I read the papers carefully. Another reckless venture, another gamble dressed as opportunity. I folded them neatly, tied them, and placed them with the others. Another knot, another thread drawn tight. That night, I did not feel weariness. I felt clarity, because by now it was no longer a matter of if. It was only a matter of when. The law moved slowly, but it moved surely. And when the machinery of ink and seal ground to its conclusion, the property he so casually dismissed, the land he mortgaged as though it were trifling, would arrive at my door. I pictured the moment in my mind, the deed once bearing his name handed to me instead. I pictured his face when he realized, not angry, not broken, simply stunned, because he would never have imagined I was capable of such a thing. And that was the sweetest part. Not the property itself, though it would be mine. Not the victory, though it would be certain. The sweetest part was the silence, that I had never raised my voice, never argued, never struck back, only waited, only signed. One evening, as I extinguished the lamp in my study, I paused and looked once more at the papers stacked high. The shadows stretched long across the floor, the air still heavy with the smell of ink. I whispered to the empty room, "The rope is ready." The day it began, the city looked the same as any other. The sky pale and washed out merchants calling in the square horses, snorting in the chill of morning air. Nothing in the cobblestones announced that one man's world was shifting beneath him. That is the beauty of silent justice. It does not arrive with thunder. It arrives with paper. The first tremor came in the form of absence. My nephew walked into a tavern expecting a warm welcome from men who had once loaned him freely. Instead, they turned away. One muttered something about not his concern anymore. Another waved him off, saying, "Talk to your uncle." He did not understand it at first. To him, I had always been the shadow behind his debts, the invisible hand smoothing over his recklessness. But shadows once noticed are no longer invisible. They are ominous. That evening, he stormed into my study without knocking, his boots striking the floor hard enough to echo. "Uncle," he barked, "what did you do?" I looked up from the ledger I was reviewing, my expression calm. "Do. They won't deal with me anymore," he snapped, pacing like a caged dog. "Every man I went to today said the same thing, that my obligations aren't theirs, they're yours. They laughed at me, Uncle." Laughed. The word laughed hung in the air. How many times had I been the one laughed at, quietly behind my back or brazenly in my own home? And now the sound had turned against him. I folded the ledger closed and set my spectacles on the desk. "Perhaps you should consider why they say that," I replied softly. He froze, staring at me as though seeing me for the first time. You took them, all of them." I did not answer. Silence was sharper than any admission. He cursed, slammed his fist against the bookshelf, then turned on his heel and stormed out. The door shook in its frame when it slammed shut. I did not rise. I simply reopened the ledger and continued reading. The next weeks peeled layers from him, like bark stripped from a tree. At first, he blustered. He laughed louder than ever, bought rounds of drinks at taverns, boasted that nothing had changed. But whispers spread quickly in this city. Men who once followed his laughter now watched him with wary eyes. They knew his debts no longer lived in many hands, but in one, mine, and I did not share them back. Soon, the invitations stopped. The friends dwindled. The tavern doors grew cooler in their welcome. He walked into rooms expecting applause and was met with silence. That is the cruelest cut of all, when the world withdraws not with a blow but with indifference. One morning, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to my door. I signed for it, closed the door, and carried it to my study. The wax seal cracked neatly beneath my thumb. Inside lay the notice I had been waiting for. The deed. My name written where his once was. I traced the letters, slowly savoring the weight of them. It was not triumph, I felt, nor gloating, nor even relief. It was something quieter. Vindication. A balancing of the ledger. That evening, my nephew arrived again, his face pale, his eyes wide. He carried a letter of his own, crumpled from his grip. He slammed it down on my desk, his voice breaking. This. What is this? Tell me it's a mistake. I smoothed the paper with my hand. It was a notice of transfer. Official, irrevocable. His signature among the others, though, he likely had not read what he signed when the ink was still wet. He never read the details. There is no mistake, I said, my voice steady. He staggered back as though struck. His mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came. Finally he whispered, "You planned this." I met his gaze, my expression calm, almost gentle. "I recorded what you gave me." His face flushed with anger, then drained with fear. He cursed me, called me a traitor, shouted that family does not do this to family. I let him rage. His words crashed against me like waves against a cliff, noisy, impotent, destined to break themselves apart. When he had spent himself, I spoke. Family does not mock those who save them. Family does not laugh at sacrifice. You chose this. Every signature, every jest, every careless word, you chose it. He stood trembling his chest, heaving his fist clenched, but he said nothing more. At last, he turned and stumbled out the door, clicking shut behind him with less fury than before. I sat alone once more, the deed before me. The house was silent but for the ticking of the clock on the mantel, and I smiled, because the laughter that had once filled these walls was gone, and in its place was something far stronger: respect. Not from him, he would never give it, but from the world, from the law, from the very papers he had mocked. The deed was mine, the silence was mine, the justice was mine. When a man falls, it is rarely sudden. The world does not hurl him from a cliff. Instead, it pulls back step by step, leaving him standing alone in widening silence until he realizes the ground beneath him is gone. That was how my nephew fell. In the weeks after the deed changed hands, I watched from a distance as his life began to shrink. It started in small ways: a missed invitation, a cooler tone from acquaintances, a seat left conspicuously unoffered at gatherings where once he held court. These are the first cracks in a man's illusion of importance, the quiet ways society tells him he is no longer welcome. I saw him once in the square, standing among men who had once leaned in to hear his boasts. Now they leaned away. Their laughter no longer rose at his jokes. Instead, their eyes darted to one another, cautious, calculating. He stood straighter, spoke louder, tried to drown the silence with bluster, but it only made the gap wider. Even the tavern keeper, who had once poured him drinks with a smile, began to serve him with the same politeness reserved for strangers. And strangers do not drink for free. At home, I returned each evening to my study, the deed safe among the stack of papers that had grown into a monument of patience. I did not gloat. I did not boast. I simply lived as I always had, measured, quiet, steady. That was enough. The world could see the difference without my saying a word, but my nephew could not. One evening he came again. This time he knocked a small change, but telling. When I opened the door, I saw the strain in his face. His eyes were tired, the circles beneath them dark. His clothes, once immaculate, were rumpled. The confidence had not entirely left his voice, but it cracked at the edges. "Uncle," he said, stepping aside, "we can fix this. Just tell them you'll release it. Give me back the deed and I'll make it right. We can be family again." I studied him quietly. Family, I repeated the word, tasting different in my mouth now. When you mocked me at your table, when you laughed at me before your friends, was that family? He flinched but pressed on. "I was foolish. You know that. But you've always forgiven me." I shook my head slowly. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. I forgave. I never forgot. His mouth opened as though to argue, but no words came. He looked smaller then, as if the weight of his own choices had finally begun to crush him. I poured a glass of water, slid it across the table to him. He stared at it, then at me, as though unsure if it were kindness or judgment. Perhaps it was both. "Uncle," he whispered, "they don't respect me anymore." I held his gaze. "They never respected you. They respected what I carried for you. And now they respect where it belongs. The truth is, a heavy drink harder to swallow than brandy." He lowered his eyes, said nothing more, and left. After he was gone, I sat alone with the papers once again. The silence in the room was deep but not empty. It was the silence of completion, of balance restored. Over the following months, I heard of him less and less. The friends who once circled him found new tables. The creditors no longer sought him, for there was nothing left to seek. He became a ghost at the edges of gatherings, a presence tolerated but not welcomed. His laughter, once the loudest in the room, grew rare, then faded altogether. And still, I said nothing. That was the power of it. I did not need to shout my victory. I did not need to wave the deed in his face or proclaim my triumph. The world saw it on its own. They saw it in the way his swagger faltered, in the way his name no longer opened doors. They saw it in the steadiness of my step, the quiet respect with which men greeted me. One afternoon, I walked through the market as I often did, my cane tapping the stones. The butcher tipped his hat, the tailor bowed his head, the banker paused to shake my hand. Their respect was not loud, but it was firm, steady. And when my nephew passed by on the other side of the street, heads turned not toward him, but away. I did not smile at his suffering. I am not so cruel. But I allowed myself a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the world had restored its balance. For years, he had laughed while I carried the weight. Now he carried the silence while I walked lighter than ever. The deed lay safe in my study, tucked among the others, not flaunted, not displayed. It did not need to be. I knew what it meant. He knew what it meant. That was enough. I sometimes wonder if he ever truly understood the lesson. Perhaps not. Some men never learn, no matter how far they fall. But whether he understood or not no longer mattered. The laughter had ended. The arrogance had cracked. And the name on the deed, my name, spoke louder than any words. One evening, as the sun sank behind the rooftops and the sky turned to embers, I sat at my window, the glass cool beneath my hand. The city below hummed with life merchants closing stalls, children calling to one another, the faint sound of bells in the distance. And I thought, this is what justice sounds like. Not thunder, not applause, just quiet balance restored. There comes a day when even victory softens into stillness. The papers are signed, the property secured, the laughter silenced. And what remains is not triumph, but peace. I did not celebrate the deed. I did not throw open my study windows and shout to the street that justice was mine. That is the way of the young to believe that victories are meant to be seen, to be paraded. For men like me, victory is quieter. It is a weight lifted, a breath eased, a silence finally free of mockery. The house I had taken from my nephew, once his pride, now my possession, stood firm and dignified. It was not grand, not ostentatious, but it was solid. I walked its halls slowly, my cane tapping against wooden floors, the smell of polish and dust filling the air. The rooms were bare in places, the remnants of his recklessness visible, still unpaid repairs, corners, neglected echoes of carelessness. But beneath that, I could see the bones of it. Strong beams, steady stone, things that endure even when laughter fades. I had no desire to erase all signs of him. Let his shadow linger in these rooms. It was a reminder. Not of cruelty, but of patience, rewarded. Neighbors noticed, of course. Word traveled in quiet ways. Some stopped to tip their hats when they passed, offering small nods of approval. Others whispered not unkindly about how the world had a way of setting things right. I acknowledged them with a faint smile, nothing more. I did not need to explain myself. Explanation is for men who doubt. My nephew, I heard, had moved into a smaller place. Nothing shabby, but smaller, humbler. His laughter no longer filled taverns. His name no longer carried weight. I saw him once at a distance, walking quickly, his shoulders hunched, as though bracing against a wind no one else could feel. He did not see me. Or if he did, he pretended not to. I felt no gloating then, only a quiet, steady certainty the world had balanced its ledger. At night, I often sat by the fire, a glass of brandy in hand, the deed resting in its folder beside me. I would not look at it long, only long enough to remind myself that patience, though mocked, is never wasted. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls, and I would lean back, close my eyes, and let the warmth sink into my bones. I thought often of my father. Debts are chains, he used to say. How right he was. But he never told me the other truth. I had discovered chains can bind, yes, but they can also lead. If you hold them long enough, they pull, not you, but the one who forged them carelessly. And my nephew had forged many. The truth of revenge is not in its fire, but in its frost. The world believes vengeance to be a blaze, consuming reckless. But the vengeance I carried was colder. It crept slowly, inch by inch, until he awoke one day to find himself encased in it. What satisfaction I felt was not in his suffering, but in my dignity restored. For years he had laughed at me as though patience were weakness. Now men looked at me and saw strength. Not the loud kind, but the kind that endures. One evening an old friend visited. We shared a meal, the table heavy with bread, cheese, and roasted meat. Over wine he leaned forward and asked quietly, "Edward, was it worth it?" I considered before answering. The firelight flickered against the walls, the air rich with the scent of wood smoke. "It was not about worth," I said at last. "It was about balance." He mocked the silence that carried him. Now the silence has answered. My friend nodded slowly, understanding. After he left, I sat alone once more, listening to the quiet. Outside, the wind rustled faintly through the trees, the city beyond, alive with distant noise. But inside there was only stillness. I thought then of the boy, my nephew, had once been the child who clutched his mother's sleeve at his father's funeral, the boy who once looked at me with trust instead of scorn. Somewhere along the way, he had chosen arrogance over gratitude. I could not change that. But I had shown him at last that silence is not weakness. Perhaps in some distant corner of his heart he would remember. Perhaps he would finally learn the lesson he had avoided all his life. Perhaps not. Either way, the matter was closed, the papers were signed, the deed was mine, and my dignity, long mocked, stood unshaken. I raised my glass to the fire, the amber liquid catching the light, and whispered softly, not as a boast, but as a truth. Some debts can only be paid in silence. I have lived long enough to know that life is not measured in the moments when people cheer for you, but in the moments when no one speaks against you. Respect, true respect, is not loud. It is the absence of scorn. For years I bore the laughter. I allowed my nephew to make a stage of me, to turn sacrifice into a jest, to wear my patience like a fool's cap upon my head. And all the while I said nothing. People thought I was weak, soft, unwilling to defend myself. Perhaps even he believed it. Perhaps I believed it at times. But now, in the stillness of my home, with the fire whispering low in the hearth and the deed tucked away safely in my drawer, I know the truth. Silence is not weakness. It is preparation. The pen had always been my weapon. While others raised voices or fists, I raised ink. While others lashed out in anger, I waited. And when the time came, it was not anger that struck my nephew down. It was his own hand signing away pieces of himself, one careless debt at a time. I merely collected what he offered. There is a peculiar satisfaction in that, in winning without shouting, in prevailing without cruelty. I did not need to confront him, to humiliate him in public, to scream back the laughter he once gave me. My victory came in the form of silence, of the quiet arrival of a deed bearing my name. A single envelope delivered like any other. No trumpets, no applause, just ink, seal, and truth. And that was enough. When I walk now through the market, men nod with respect. Women greet me kindly. Children step aside when my cane taps against the stones, not because I am powerful in wealth or title, but because they see a man who endured, who bore years of scorn and yet stood unbroken. That carries more weight than gold. My nephew, meanwhile, moves through the same streets like a shadow of his former self. His laughter no longer echoes. His boasts no longer draw crowds. I do not seek him out, but when I glimpse him at a distance, I see the change in him. Shoulders hunched, eyes downcast, steps hurried. He avoids me now, though I have never spoken a harsh word to him. He avoids me because he knows. And that is the deepest cut of all, to realize the man you mock now holds without raising a hand the power you squandered. Do I pity him? In some ways, yes. He could have been different. He could have grown into the man his father hoped for, the man I once believed I was shaping him to be. But he chose arrogance. He chose mockery. And choices bear fruit, bitter or sweet. I will not deny that I take comfort in what I have done. Not comfort in his downfall, but in the restoration of balance. For too long the scales tilted under the weight of my silence. Now at last they are level. At night I sometimes dream of my father. I see him standing by the old fields, the sweat of labor on his brow, his voice steady as he says again, debts are chains. I wake and think to myself, yes, Father, But you never told me the second truth, that chains can be turned into reins, and reins can guide a man exactly where you wish him to go. My nephew gave me the chains. I simply held them until he had no ground left to stand on. What then is my legacy? It is not the deed, though, that will remain in my name until my death. It is not the wealth, though, I will leave enough behind to be remembered. My legacy is the lesson itself, that silence endures, that patience prevails, that a pen can carve deeper wounds than any blade. If others mock you, let them. If they laugh, let them. Laughter fades, paper remains. The world remembers not the noise, but the balance. And balance once restored needs no explanation. Tonight I sit in my study, the lamplight warm the papers, neatly stack the clock, ticking softly on the mantel. Outside the city hums its endless rhythm. Inside, all is calm. I raise my glass once more, the amber liquid catching the light, and I whisper not to my nephew, not to the world, but to myself. I smile when the deed arrived because the silence has spoken. And with that, the ledger of my life feels balanced.